Claire held in her leather purse the single document keeping the entire Anderson family afloat. While her husband Ryan prepared to humiliate her in front of their relatives, presenting his mistress Victoria as the woman who truly belonged in his elite circle, nobody at that sprawling mahogany table in Greenwich, Connecticut, knew that the very person they were silently judging was the only one capable of saving them from total financial ruin. What Claire did in the subsequent 10 minutes brought a powerful American dynasty to its knees, all without screaming, without crying, and without begging. She had arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did, for these Sunday gatherings, wearing a simple navy blue dress without any flashy jewelry, preparing to simply endure another afternoon of polite smiles and thinly veiled insults disguised as upper-class manners. The dining room of that immense estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country felt suspended in time for a brief moment, as if even the clinking of the silver cutlery had understood the gravity of the situation before the people did. Ryan stood proudly beside Victoria, his hand resting comfortably on her bare back, sporting that devastatingly handsome and cruel smile frozen on the face of a man who had just presented his mistress to his own mother and uncle as a far more elegant and suitable partner. Lucille Ryan's impeccably dressed mother held her crystal glass of white wine with perfectly manicured fingers, waiting for Claire to do what she always did during these 8 years of marriage: swallow the pain, offer a weak smile, lower her gaze, and preserve the flawless facade of the Anderson family. But Claire did not lower her eyes. Instead, she gently touched the linen napkin resting on her lap, took a single deep breath, and looked at Ryan as if for the very first time she was not seeing the powerful executive she loved, but a frightened little boy hiding behind an incredibly expensive tailored suit. The elaborate lunch had been prepared with an almost aggressive perfection, featuring a long dark wooden table covered in pristine white porcelain discreet arrangements of rare orchids, and wine glasses aligned with absolute military precision by the catering staff. Outside, beyond the massive glass doors, the pristine swimming pool reflected the clear afternoon sky, while 2 silent household employees, including the head butler Samuel, moved gracefully between the state-of-the-art kitchen and the main dining area. Ryan knew that this particular Sunday gathering was vital for the family business. Anderson Investments fully aware that there would be an incredibly delicate conversation regarding their debts immediately after the dessert was served. What he either genuinely did not know or willfully pretended to ignore was that Claire had also been explicitly summoned for that exact same corporate conversation by the financial institution handling their massive restructuring. "Could you at least try to smile?" Ryan had muttered to Claire the moment he walked into the foyer, before even offering a standard greeting, while Victoria glided across the room like someone who had owned the estate for decades. "Today is not the day for that miserable funeral face," he added, completely dismissing the quiet dignity of the woman who had spent years silently fixing his reckless mistakes in the background. Claire looked calmly at him, and then shifted her gaze to the woman clinging to his arm, noting that Victoria was wearing a cream silk dress, heavy gold jewelry, perfectly styled waves in her hair, and a sickeningly sweet perfume that announced her presence long before she spoke. "Ryan has told me so much about all of you," Victoria declared confidently, blowing air kisses toward Lucille and Uncle Arthur, as if she were a legitimate, highly anticipated guest, rather than a walking betrayal entering through the massive oak front doors. Lucille immediately opened her arms with a sudden warmth she had never once offered to her actual daughter-in-law, exclaiming what an absolute pleasure it was to finally meet someone who truly understood the importance of an impeccable social presentation. Ryan chuckled softly at his mother's remark, and that low sound cut into Claire far deeper than any direct screaming accusation could have ever managed. Yet she maintained her absolute composure, and politely wished Victoria a good afternoon. The mistress tilted her head slightly, offering a patronizing smile as she replied that Ryan had mentioned Claire was a very quiet and invisible woman, and that he certainly had not exaggerated in his blunt description. The first luxurious course was served in a thick silence filled with dozens of tiny calculated cruelties, as Lucille eagerly asked Victoria endless questions about her recent European travels, contemporary art galleries, exclusive Manhattan restaurants, and relaxing weekends spent in the Hamptons. Victoria answered every inquiry with clearly rehearsed phrases, constantly glancing sideways at Claire to ensure the verbal daggers were landing deliberately, letting slip intimate details about Ryan that were far from innocent. Ryan simply prefers women who know how to navigate high society without making anyone feel awkward or uncomfortable. Victoria stated at one point, adding that she felt terrible he had been so socially limited over the past few years. Claire listened to this entirely fabricated narrative without touching a single bite of the gourmet food on her plate, keeping her hands perfectly still, even when her cell phone vibrated silently inside her purse. She saw the caller ID flashing the name Matthew, the senior bank manager, directly responsible for the massive restructuring of the Anderson family enterprise, but she chose to ignore the call, refusing to be distracted. Ryan noticed her slight movement, immediately frowning and demanding that she put the phone away aggressively, whispering that she should at least try to be mentally present for this incredibly important family gathering instead of checking her messages. Claire slowly turned off the glowing screen, looking him dead in the eye, as she replied that she was far more present than he could ever possibly imagine. A response he clearly disliked, but ignored because he was too busy putting on a grand show of dominance. Victoria gently touched his arm, telling him not to be so harsh, because some women were simply not born to handle the pressures of such elevated environments, prompting Lucille to offer a tight, completely joyless smile of agreement. It was at that exact moment that Ryan decided to elevate the simmering humiliation into a full public spectacle, lightly tapping his silver knife against the rim of his crystal water glass, to demand everyone's absolute attention as if he were about to propose a wonderful toast. "I know that my arrival here today with Victoria might cause a slight bit of discomfort," he began, barely glancing at Claire, just enough to inflict maximum emotional damage without appearing overtly hostile to his gathered relatives. "But this esteemed family desperately needs to move forward with mature grace, acknowledging that there are certain people who naturally fit the wealthy lifestyle we have built, the heavy corporate commitments we carry, and the elite circles we must continually navigate. Victoria possesses a natural, effortless elegance, a brilliant social lightness, and a sophisticated posture that has frankly been missing from my life for a very long time." Ryan declared, oblivious to Uncle Arthur awkwardly clearing his throat, or a distant cousin nervously staring down at her porcelain plate. Claire felt her fingertips turn ice-cold under the table, yet her facial expression remained a mask of absolute impenetrable calm, while Ryan continued, completely intoxicated by his own venomous words and unchecked arrogance. "I honestly do not say this to intentionally offend anyone present, but I truly believe there comes a definitive moment when we all have to admit who is genuinely up to the standards of our demanding world." Victoria feigned a brief moment of bashfulness, whispering for Ryan to please stop praising her, though her tight grip on his muscular arm requested the exact opposite, relishing every second of her public elevation. Claire vividly remembered another table many years ago, a much smaller and infinitely less luxurious one in a modest downtown coffee shop back when Ryan had no personal chauffeur, no ridiculously expensive watches, and absolutely no paralyzing fear of appearing ordinary. Back then, He had tightly held her hands across the sticky table, looking deeply into her eyes, swearing that by her side he felt entirely safe, believing he could fail miserably and still remain unconditionally loved. In those early hopeful days, Claire had believed him with every fiber of her being, believing him so deeply that she silently signed discreet financial guarantees, introduced him to powerful corporate contacts, and personally interceded with wealthy investors who deeply trusted her own mother's impeccable maiden name. She had single-handedly prevented the very first massive debt of Anderson Investments from snowballing into a catastrophic public scandal, always choosing to stand quietly in the background, beaming with immense pride whenever Ryan received roaring applause and glowing accolades. Even when Lucille slowly began treating her like a dull, unpolished piece of antique furniture, Claire naively assumed that the steady passage of time and her unwavering loyalty would eventually correct the profound injustice of her treatment. But on that specific Sunday, as she was forced to listen to her own husband declare another woman vastly superior in front of the entire family, something deep inside Claire's chest did not shatter with a loud noise. Instead, it simply unlatched. "Are you quite finished?" Claire asked softly, the absolute simplicity of her question irritating Ryan far more than any dramatic, screaming, theatrical scene ever could have, prompting him to snap back that she should not start using cheap irony. Claire carefully folded her linen napkin precisely one time, calmly explaining that it was not irony, and that she merely wanted to confirm if he was done speaking, prompting Victoria to let out a short, condescending laugh. Victoria smugly suggested that this was perhaps not the most appropriate venue for a messy marital crisis, causing Claire to turn her face toward the mistress without a single ounce of visible aggression. "You are entirely correct about that," Claire replied evenly. "A marital crisis inherently requires an actual marriage to exist. What is happening in this dining room right now is something else entirely." Lucille forcefully slammed her wineglass down onto the table, loudly demanding that her daughter-in-law moderate her disrespectful tone because they were in polite company. But Claire met the older woman's furious glare without flinching. "I have forcefully moderated my tone for exactly 8 agonizing years, Lucille," she stated plainly, causing the terrible silence in the grand dining room to instantly become so thick it felt suffocating. Ryan impatiently took a threatening step toward her, angrily accusing her of playing the pathetic victim simply because he possessed the rare courage to loudly articulate what everyone else in the wealthy family had been secretly thinking for years. Claire took one profound grounding breath, and in that precise fraction of a second, she delivered the single sentence that completely vacuumed every molecule of breathable air right out of the luxurious space. "If she is truly so incredibly elegant, then step aside and let her save your drowning family today," Claire said, with a voice far too quiet to be considered a threat, yet infinitely too firm to be mistaken for sudden weakness. Nobody fully comprehended the statement immediately, or perhaps a few of them did grasp the terrifying implication, but desperately preferred not to show their rising panic in front of the wealthy matriarch. Uncle Arthur stared intensely at Claire in a completely new light, looking exactly as if the final missing piece of a massive, complicated puzzle had just violently crashed down onto the center of the dining table. Ryan let out a dry, insulting laugh, deeply offended by the mere possibility that he was failing to comprehend a basic situation occurring inside his own spectacular home, aggressively demanding to know what crazy nonsense she was talking about. Claire completely ignored his loud demand. Instead, she slowly unzipped her leather purse, pulled out a thick beige envelope, and delicately placed it directly next to her untouched plate without sliding it toward anyone. Her phone vibrated once more with an urgent call from Matthew. But this time, Claire merely glanced at the bright screen, calmly stood up, and walked out the front door, leaving her wedding ring resting on top of the envelope for Arthur to find. The warm afternoon sunlight hit Claire's face for the first time all day as she stepped onto the grand, sweeping driveway, finally allowing her lungs to expand fully without the suffocating pressure of her husband's toxic family. Her black luxury car service had not yet arrived, but a sleek silver sedan unexpectedly pulled up perfectly parallel to the massive iron security gates just as she reached the bottom of the wide marble steps. Out stepped Matthew, the senior manager of the elite corporate bank, closely followed by a sharp-looking woman in a tailored gray suit carrying an expensive leather briefcase, both dressed strictly for an intense financial negotiation rather than a casual Sunday feast. Matthew spotted Claire standing near the grand entryway, his face instantly breaking into a massive smile of profound professional relief, an expression that rapidly evaporated the moment he registered the absolute coldness in her usually warm eyes. "Madam Claire, please accept my sincere apologies for the endless phone calls. We were strictly informed that the final verification meeting with the Anderson family would take place immediately following your lunch," the banker quickly explained. Claire stared at him in utter silence for several long seconds, hyper-aware that the massive oak front doors had swung wide open behind her, revealing Ryan sprinting down the hallway, closely trailed by a panicked Lucille and a highly confused Victoria. Matthew, completely oblivious to the intense emotional destruction that had just occurred inside, pushed forward urgently stating that without her explicit physical presence and direct signature, the bank absolutely could not advance the massive corporate restructuring of the family enterprise. That single heavily loaded sentence ripped through the grand foyer like a silent, bloodless bullet, causing Ryan to freeze entirely in his tracks, while Lucille tightly gripped the ornate back of an antique velvet armchair to steady her trembling knees. "What specific contract are you talking about?" Ryan asked, his usually booming, arrogant voice suddenly stripped of all its former confidence, sounding remarkably like a terrified junior employee facing a brutal corporate termination. Matthew looked at the frightened executive, then back to Claire, with growing discomfort, before formally clarifying that the primary financial guarantee securing the massive bailout agreement was entirely based upon the personal untouchable assets of Madame Claire Miller. The banker continued completely unaware of the bomb he was dropping, explaining that the emergency meeting today was scheduled specifically to finalize the binding conditions using her family's wealth, making Claire close her eyes briefly upon hearing her powerful maiden name spoken aloud. Lucille stumbled one step forward, her face completely drained of color, as she aggressively insisted to the banker that there had to be some ridiculous clerical error, because her brilliant son personally conducted all the vital business negotiations for the entire corporation. The stern woman in the gray suit adjusted her glasses and responded with an incredibly sharp-cutting courtesy, correcting the matriarch by stating that while Ryan handled the basic operational negotiations, he had absolutely zero control over the massive patrimonial guarantee, keeping them solvent. Uncle Arthur, standing quietly behind the frantic group, was already holding the torn-open beige envelope in his trembling hands, his face looking completely devastated as he read the undeniable legal proof of Claire's secret monumental sacrifices. Ryan stared at his wife as though she had committed the ultimate unforgivable act of high treason, simply by proving she was infinitely larger, wealthier, and more powerful than his fragile ego had ever allowed him to imagine. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Ryan demanded desperately, the pathetic question tumbling out of his mouth long before his brain could process how utterly absurd and hypocritical it sounded given his recent behavior. Claire met his terrified gaze, and for the very first time that entire Sunday, a deep, heavy shadow of profound exhaustion darkened her expressive eyes as she firmly told him that she had in fact told him multiple times over the years. She reminded him in a voice devoid of any warmth that he only ever bothered to listen to her financial advice when her massive corporate interventions magically arrived without her powerful maiden name attached to them. Ryan opened his mouth to argue, closed it quickly, and then desperately looked toward Victoria as if silently begging his new mistress to provide some impossible magical explanation that would save his crumbling corporate empire. Victoria hastily attempted to regain her shattered composure, nervously smoothing her perfectly styled hair, while stepping forward to declare confidently that Claire was obviously just using her massive wealth as a sick, desperate tool to manipulate him into staying. Claire almost offered a tiny smile, but there was absolutely no humor left in her battered soul, calmly correcting the mistress by stating she used her vast personal fortune purely to protect an ungrateful family that constantly called her a heavy burden. The strike was flawlessly clean, incredibly low, and delivered completely without a single raised voice, causing Victoria to pale significantly. As Matthew loudly cleared his throat, finally realizing he had inadvertently stepped into an incredibly intimate and explosive domestic war zone. The anxious bank manager respectfully offered to indefinitely reschedule the vital financial signing if Claire preferred a suggestion that made Ryan visibly panic, screaming that there was absolutely no need to delay because Claire was going to come back inside and resolve everything like mature adults. Claire gracefully stepped down one final marble stair just as her black luxury vehicle arrived silently behind the bankers, turning back one last time to coldly inform Ryan that mature adults do not present their mistresses at family lunches to violently humiliate their wives before begging for a corporate bailout. Claire instructed her driver to drop her off in front of a remarkably discreet, quiet coffee shop located in the bustling heart of the financial district. The exact kind of obscure establishment situated on the ground floor of towering glass corporate buildings where nobody asked unnecessary questions. She deliberately chose a small, isolated table, tucked perfectly into the farthest corner, sitting with her back firmly pressed against the solid brick wall, feeling an overwhelming need to fundamentally relearn how to feel safe, just taking a breath. When the young, polite waitress approached to softly ask what she desired, Claire requested nothing more than a simple black coffee and a tall glass of sparkling water, placing her hands flat on the wooden table. Her left ring finger still bore the pale, distinct indentation where the heavy gold wedding band had securely rested for 8 long years. And as she stared blankly at that tiny, empty circle, she realized she did not miss the precious metal at all. Instead, she deeply mourned the incredibly naive, hopeful woman who had foolishly believed that that specific circle of gold actually protected a sacred bond, rather than merely serving as a shiny shackle tying her to a family of arrogant parasites. During the short ride, she had received exactly 17 frantic text messages from Ryan. The first few were demanding orders which rapidly transitioned into desperate rambling explanations, finally devolving into bitter, angry accusations about how she had cruelly exposed him. He complained bitterly that his fragile mother was feeling physically ill from the sudden shock, demanding that Claire return immediately to the estate, and explicitly warning her not to weaponize the family business just to harshly punish his minor indiscretions. Shortly after his barrage ended, a single highly calculated message arrived from Lucille coldly stating that a true woman of high class never abandons her loyal family in such a humiliating public manner, regardless of whatever petty domestic misunderstandings might occur. Claire typed out a blistering reply wanting to scream that a truly classy family absolutely never formally introduces a cheap mistress to a devoted daughter-in-law during a sacred Sunday lunch, but she stopped herself and deleted the angry draft entirely. She desperately wanted, for the very first time in her adult life, to act decisively without silently begging for permission from her own crushing pain, refusing to let them dictate her emotional responses or drag her into their toxic, chaotic mud. When Matthew, the bank manager, bravely called her phone once again, his normally confident voice was laced with extreme caution and deep professional respect, formally apologizing for the intense discomfort of the earlier ambush at the grand residential estate. Claire stared vacantly out the large front window at the endless rows of yellow taxis crawling along the busy avenue, firmly instructing him to instantly suspend the entire meeting and clearly document that absolutely zero financial conditions would remain intact without a brutal independent legal review. Meanwhile, back inside the sprawling Anderson mansion, the oppressive, heavy luxury of the massive estate seemed to have completely lost its magical ability to mask the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the remaining family members. The extravagant gourmet feast remained perfectly served on the long table, yet absolutely nobody dared to take a bite. The expensive imported fish grew cold and rubbery on the fine porcelain, and the vintage white wine slowly turned incredibly bitter in their dry mouths. Victoria remained awkwardly seated in the previously triumphant chair right next to Ryan's empty spot, desperately attempting to look highly offended by the dramatic turn of events, rather than absolutely terrified that her golden ticket had just evaporated into thin air. Lucille paced frantically back and forth across the priceless Persian rug, clutching the beige envelope so tightly her knuckles turned bright white, looking at the legal documents as if the very paper had violently insulted her prestigious, aristocratic lineage. She demanded to know how her supposedly brilliant son could be so completely blind, while Uncle Arthur simply let out a dark, utterly joyless laugh, pointing out that Ryan only ever signed the pretty, highly publicized contracts, while his silent wife absorbed all the massive, terrifying risks. Ryan absolutely loathed hearing those harsh words, but he hated his own total lack of a coherent defense even more. For 8 years, he had gladly accepted Claire's massive corporate interventions the same way an arrogant man accepts a glass of water he believes he inherently deserves. Whenever the struggling company had nearly lost an absolutely critical infrastructure project, Claire had gently suggested a powerful private investor. Whenever a massive, overdue debt threatened to become a scandalous front-page headline, she quietly recommended a highly discreet, miracle-working corporate lawyer. When Lucille had foolishly insisted on completely renovating the summer estate to entertain potential foreign partners, Claire had secretly liquidated a massive personal investment, softly suggesting it was best not to openly discuss the funding until the company accounts were fully reorganized. All those distant memories came flooding back to Ryan right now, but they were horrifically distorted by an agonizing wave of pure shame. Back then, he had arrogantly labeled her actions as basic wifely support. But the brutal documents proved it was absolute, undeniable dependency. Inside the quiet coffee shop, Claire's formidable corporate attorney Eleanor finally arrived without any apparent rush, though her sharp, calculating eyes clearly indicated she already understood at least half of the massive legal storm currently brewing. Eleanor was a highly intimidating woman in her late 40s, wearing her dark hair in a tight bun, dressed in a sharp ivory suit, radiating a cold, clinical calm that never once asked for permission to completely dominate a room. She sat down directly across from Claire, placed a thick black leather folder onto the table, and before speaking a single word about the pending bank documents, she leaned forward and softly asked her client if her husband had physically touched her during the confrontation. Claire slowly shook her head, clarifying that Ryan had merely attempted to bark useless orders at her, just like he always did, which prompted Eleanor to take a deep breath, firmly declaring that they could easily handle the rest of the financial fallout. Claire nervously gripped her warm coffee cup quietly, admitting that she honestly did not want to entirely destroy the family company, because hundreds of innocent employees relied on those paychecks. A sentiment Eleanor absorbed with a look of profound, unwavering attention. The razor-sharp lawyer completely agreed, but sternly promised that she would absolutely never allow Claire to continue blindly rescuing a broken corporate structure that gleefully exploited her pristine name, massive assets, and stellar reputation while treating her like an inconvenient stray dog. The very first aggressive legal measure they drafted was beautifully simple yet incredibly heavy. A formal, legally binding notification instantly dispatched to the central bank, indefinitely suspending any physical confirmation of the bailout funds until every single term was ruthlessly reviewed. The second, far more explosive measure was to completely legally block Ryan Lucille or any other acting member of Anderson Investments from ever using the prestigious Miller family name in any future negotiations without Claire's explicit, written and notarized authorization. Eleanor meticulously explained every single bullet point without raising her voice or exaggerating the impact using dry surgical words that forced Claire to listen in absolute silence, while every sentence violently ripped away another thick layer of her old, comforting, romantic illusions. Early the exact next morning, the towering glass headquarters of Anderson Investments seemed noticeably colder than usual, reflecting a pale gray city sky, while the nervous employees scurried across the grand lobby with the quiet dread of people sensing a massive corporate collapse. Ryan arrived significantly early, completely forgetting to wear his signature silk tie. His bloodshot eyes heavily ringed with deep dark bags, proving he had absolutely not slept a single minute during the agonizing, revelation-filled night. For the first time in his entire entitled corporate career, the front desk receptionists greeted him with an incredibly strange, cautious hesitation, treating him exactly as if he had magically transformed overnight from the powerful heir apparent into a walking scandal about to explode. Sitting heavily behind his massive mahogany desk, Ryan found 3 massive, dusty archival folders that Uncle Arthur had deliberately left there during the early hours of the morning, each containing hard copies of massive corporate victories Ryan had falsely claimed as his own. In every single file, tucked neatly into the bottom right corner, where his arrogant eyes had never bothered to look, rested the firm, undeniable signature of Claire Miller, explicitly using her powerful maiden name instead of his own carefully guarded family surname. He ran his trembling fingers over the dark blue ink, a dry, suffocating wave of intense shame rising rapidly in his throat, as he vividly recalled her coming home exhausted from secret board meetings he had never even bothered to ask her about. Victoria unexpectedly stormed into the executive office shortly past 10 o'clock, completely unannounced, aggressively strutting down the carpeted executive hallway, wearing oversized black sunglasses and carrying a bright red designer handbag that drew far too much inappropriate attention. The panicked senior secretary desperately attempted to physically block the doorway, but Ryan, feeling utterly exhausted and utterly defeated, waved his hand dismissively, ordering the poor woman to just let the furious mistress inside to finish the inevitable messy confrontation. Victoria ripped off her expensive sunglasses, revealing deeply irritated, rather than genuinely sorrowful eyes, aggressively accusing Ryan of being completely manipulated by his supposedly saintly wife, loudly demanding that he stop treating her like she was the core problem in this disaster. Ryan leaned heavily against his desk, quietly reminding Victoria that she had willingly entered his family home, fully knowing his actual wife would be sitting right there, a harsh truth that prompted Victoria to defensively shout that he was the one who brought her. The mistress venomously pushed forward, stating that he desperately wanted to show her off, wanting to prove to his snobbish mother that he could attract a truly elite woman, angrily demanding he not blame her just because he suddenly discovered his boring wife possessed massive wealth. Ryan violently slammed one of the heavy archive folders, shut, his voice suddenly dropping to a dangerous icy whisper as he explicitly ordered Victoria to absolutely never speak about Claire in that incredibly disrespectful tone ever again. The absolutely crucial board meeting was officially scheduled for exactly noon in the highest, most intimidating glass conference room of the towering skyscraper, a space whose breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling city usually served as a silent, overwhelming argument of ultimate corporate power. Lucille arrived first wearing a stiff, dark blue designer suit and a massive pearl necklace that looked tighter than a hangman's noose, while Arthur followed closely behind, looking incredibly stern and actively avoiding making any eye contact with the highly cautious senior directors. Matthew, the banker, sat nervously on the far right side, alongside his brilliant legal consultant, while Ryan entered last, choosing to stand silently by the floor-to-ceiling windows rather than taking his usual triumphant seat at the exact head of the table. Claire finally entered the room, exactly on time, flanked closely by the formidable Eleanor, and joined unexpectedly by an old, trusted Miller family friend named Thomas, who served as an incredibly sharp, uncompromising, independent financial auditor. Claire wore a beautifully simple, flawlessly tailored white pantsuit, completely devoid of heavy makeup or flashy jewels, making absolutely zero desperate attempts to look richer, angrier, or more powerful than she genuinely was. Yet her quiet presence instantly commanded absolute respect. The heavy silence that followed her graceful entrance was entirely different from the pathetic silence of the Sunday lunch. On Sunday, they had foolishly expected her to shrink, but this morning every single person in that room knew she held their absolute survival in her hands. Lucille pathetically attempted to forcefully seize control of the rapidly deteriorating narrative by offering a wide, entirely fake smile, loudly proclaiming how incredibly happy she was that Claire had shown up to elegantly resolve this minor family misunderstanding. Claire calmly placed her sleek leather folder onto the polished table, taking her seat slowly, before looking directly into her mother-in-law's panicked eyes, firmly stating that true elegance was absolutely not pretending. A betrayal never happened, but rather refusing to turn the painful truth into a cheap circus. That single devastatingly calm sentence sliced horizontally across the massive room, without any raised volume whatsoever, immediately ensuring that absolutely nobody dared to take a single sip of their provided gourmet coffee for the remainder of the tense negotiation. Eleanor swiftly distributed a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents outlining the brutally strict new demands, clearly stating that her client absolutely refused to let her pristine reputation and massive assets be exploited without total financial transparency and strict external oversight. The terrifying new conditions mandated an aggressive independent audit, conducted by Thomas, the absolute prohibition of assuming any new corporate debt without Claire's notarized signature, and the immediate humiliating suspension of Ryan's executive decision-making powers regarding high-risk investments. Lucille visibly reddened with intense, poorly suppressed rage, loudly accusing Claire of vindictively weaponizing the fragile company just to cruelly punish her brilliant son for a simple mistake. But Eleanor instantly shot back that they were merely stopping the company from punishing its secret savior. Ryan finally stepped away from the massive window looking at the printed documents, before firmly grabbing his expensive silver pen, fully knowing that signing these binding papers would effectively strip away his remaining corporate crown and completely shatter his massive ego. He signed his name quickly, pushing the heavy stack of papers toward the stunned senior directors, quietly ordering them to aggressively implement every single one of the demanded changes without further argument, completely ignoring his mother's frantic, desperate gasps of profound disbelief. When the intense, grueling formalization finally concluded over an hour later, absolutely nobody clapped or offered fake relieving hugs. There was merely a heavy, sad exhaustion as Claire respectfully shook the banker's hand softly, noting that the truly difficult part was waiting so incredibly long to act. Out in the quiet, carpeted corporate hallway, Ryan quickly caught up to Claire just before she stepped into the waiting private elevator, respectfully maintaining a healthy physical distance, as if finally understanding that true closeness strictly required earned permission. He desperately wanted to deliver a massive cinematic apology, but looking at her calm face, he simply confessed that he had cowardly erased her contributions because he was utterly terrified of admitting how deeply he truly needed her. Claire looked back at him, the heavy elevator doors slowly beginning to close, and honestly replied that the meeting today had successfully saved his failing company, but it absolutely had not saved the two of them. Exactly 3 long months later, Claire finalized the lease on her very own spectacular apartment overlooking the bustling city park, featuring massive windows, bright white walls, and a beautiful light oak dining table she picked out entirely by herself. She spent her peaceful mornings brewing incredibly strong black coffee, thoroughly enjoying the profound silence that no longer felt like a heavy punishment, frequently hosting Eleanor and her bright young paralegal Jessica for casual, laughter-filled evening dinners. She carefully locked her old gold wedding band inside a tiny velvet box, not keeping it as a pathetic promise of a romantic return, but rather as a powerful, undeniable physical proof of her own incredible emotional survival. Ryan eventually reached out requesting a completely neutral conversation, and Claire agreed to meet him on a bright Saturday morning in a quiet, heavily wooded section of the city park, far away from the toxic mansions and the high-pressure corporate skyscrapers. He arrived carrying 2 cups of plain black coffee, looking significantly healthier and far less burdened by his own inflated importance, walking slowly beside her, while admitting he had finally started attending intensive therapy sessions to address his profound insecurities. He softly admitted that he deeply missed her, but Claire gently stopped walking, looking directly at the towering green trees, firmly replying that she absolutely refused to ever return to a magnificent house where she was forced to completely disappear. He nodded with genuine understanding, promising he would not beg her to come back, but rather focus completely on becoming a man who did not require a woman to shrink so he could feel exceptionally tall. There was absolutely no grand theatrical reconciliation, no passionate kissing under the falling leaves, and absolutely zero promises of a magical second honeymoon to easily erase the 8 years of emotional neglect. Instead, Claire smoothly transitioned the conversation to the necessary legal logistics of formally filing for an official separation, feeling an incredible wave of absolute freedom wash over her chest, as Ryan swallowed hard and softly agreed to sign whatever she needed to feel safe. As Claire walked back to her sunlit apartment that afternoon, she realized her immense value was never defined by the expensive clothes she wore, the elite tables she sat at, or the powerful man she stood silently behind. True strength often requires walking away from spaces that demand your silence, recognizing that genuine love never asks you to constantly sacrifice your dignity to protect someone else's fragile pride. We often spend years desperately trying to fix broken people, pouring our golden energy into bottomless pits, mistakenly believing that our endless suffering will eventually be rewarded with basic respect. Life's hardest but most liberating lesson is learning that your true home is never a physical place or another person. It is the absolute, unshakable peace you cultivate within yourself when you finally decide your own voice matters. Only when you possess the courage to leave the table where respect is no longer being served can you truly sit down at the grand banquet of your own beautiful, uncompromised life.